The wind was a liar in Twilight Canyon. It mimicked the voices of the dead, whispering through the sparse, claw-like branches of the junipers that clung to the canyon walls. Tonight, it whispered her husband's name, Alara. The sound was so clear, so like the way Thomas had said it, a soft burr at the end, that she flinched, dropping the pewter spoon into the thin broth simmering over the hearth. It clattered with a sound too loud for the suffocating quiet of the cabin. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to force back the image of him, pale and still on their shared bed, the fever having finally stolen the last of his breath 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks or a lifetime. The calendar she kept with charcoal marks on a scrap, of which said 3 weeks. The hollowed-out space inside her chest, a cavern carved by grief, felt ageless. The cabin, once a bastion of shared dreams and warm laughter, had become a tomb. Every object held a ghost. Thomas's worn coat still hung from a peg by the door, the scent of pine sap and him clinging to the wool. His rifle, a heavy, long-barreled Winchester, rested on its brackets above the mantelpiece, its blued steel seeming to absorb the last of the day's meager light. It was her only real protection now, and it felt as alien and useless in her hands as a stone. He had tried to teach her, his large, warm hands guiding hers, his voice patient. Just squeeze, Alara. Don't pull. But her fingers had always trembled, her shoulder anticipating the violent kick, her mind shying away from the terrible purpose of the machine. Now, the fear was a different creature altogether. It was not the fear of the rifle's power, but of her own powerlessness without the will to use it. Outside, the sun bled out behind the western rim of the canyon, painting the undersides of the clouds in bruised shades of violet and orange. The long, predatory shadows of evening crept down the rock faces, swallowing the light whole. This was the hour she dreaded most. The world shrank to the flickering circle of her lamplight, and the vast, indifferent wilderness pressed in from all sides. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a distant coyote, was a potential threat. The men in the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings called Providence, had made their opinions clear. Some with pitying looks that felt like acid, others with a leering sort of solicitude that was far worse. A woman alone was a problem to be solved, an opportunity to be taken, or a tragedy waiting to happen. Mr. Henderson, the mercantile owner, had offered his protection, his hand lingering on her arm a moment too long, his eyes crawling over her as if she were another bolt of calico to be appraised and acquired. She had fled his store with her meager supplies, the shame burning hotter than the sun on her neck. She was truly alone. Her nearest neighbor was a full day's ride east, and to the west, deeper in the labyrinth of stone and shadow, there was only him, the man they called Silas. No one knew his last name or where he'd come from. He lived like a ghost in a dilapidated lined shack tucked into a crease of the mountains, emerging only a few times a year to trade perfectly tanned pelts for salt, flour, and ammunition. The whispers in Providence painted him as a savage, a man who had turned his back on God and society, perhaps with blood on his hands. Thomas had met him once on a hunt and had described him differently. Quiet, he'd said, thoughtful. He just watches, like he's seeing the world a different way than us now. The thought of this man, this unknown quantity, so near, was just another specter to haunt her twilight hours. Alara ladled the watery soup into a bowl, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. The broth was tasteless, but she forced herself to eat. She had to be strong. Thomas had poured his life into this small patch of land, wresting it from the unforgiving earth. She could not let it, and herself, crumble to dust. She was washing the bowl in the basin when a sudden shift in the light made her freeze. The faint, golden glow from her window, which had been painting a lopsided rectangle on the packed earth floor, was gone. Blocked. A shape, broad and absolute, filled the doorframe, a silhouette against the dying sky. Her heart seized, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. She didn't make a sound. She couldn't. Her breath was trapped in her throat, a stone of pure terror. The figure stood perfectly still, a part of the encroaching darkness. It was a man, tall and wide-shouldered, the brim of a worn hat obscuring his face. For a paralyzing moment, she thought one of the leering men from Providence had made good on their unspoken threats. Then he moved, a slight tilt of his head, and the last vestiges of light caught the hard planes of a bearded face and the glint of something in his eyes. It was him, Silas, the canyon ghost. He had made no sound approaching, no crunch of boots on gravel, no cough to announce his presence. He had simply appeared, as if conjured from the shadows themselves. She stood rooted to the spot, the damp cloth clutched in her hand, her mind screaming a single, silent word. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The cabin was a trap, and the vast, dark wilderness was his world, not hers. He did not speak. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, filled only by the frantic drumming of her own pulse in her ears. He stood just outside the threshold, one hand resting almost casually on the stock of the rifle he carried, the other hanging loose at his side. He seemed to be looking not directly at her, but at the space around her, taking in the sparse contents of her cabin with an unnerving stillness. She could feel his gaze like a physical touch, cataloging her vulnerability, the single cot, the cooling hearth, the lone woman outlined by the lamplight. She was a beacon of solitude, a signal of weakness. Her mind raced, fumbling for a plan. The rifle. Thomas's rifle above the mantel. It was an impossible distance away. To get to it, she would have to move past him, or at least turn her back. A fatal mistake. She remained frozen, a statue of fear, her knuckles white where she gripped the dishcloth. Why was he here? The stories from town swirled in her head. A man who shunned contact, who was more animal than human. His presence here, at her door at this hour, could mean only one thing. He had come to take what he wanted. Finally, he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He raised his free hand, not in a threat, but holding something out to her. It was dark and small. Her eyes struggled to focus in the deepening gloom. It was a piece of dried meat, long and thin. A peace offering? A trick? He took a single, slow step forward, his boots now on the wooden plank of her stoop. The wood did not creak. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had ever heard it. The sound did not fit the monstrous image the town had created. It was just a voice, deep, quiet, and devoid of any discernible emotion. He gestured with a jerky toward the darkening canyon behind him. "Riders," he said, the word clip stark. "Saw tracks. 3 of them. Not drovers." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. He wasn't looking at her face, but the lamp on her table, its small flame a bright, defiant star in the encroaching night. "Light carries," he added, his meaning brutally clear. The lamp that gave her comfort was also a signal, a declaration of her presence to anyone who might be watching from the canyon rim. He was not here to harm her. He was here to warn her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, so unexpected that it momentarily dislodged the terror. Her fear of him began to curdle, transmuting into a new, more complex anxiety. Fear of the unknown men he spoke of, and a profound, unnerving confusion about the man standing before her. He was still a threat, a massive, unpredictable force of nature at her doorstep, but the nature of that threat had suddenly, terrifyingly, changed. "Who?" she managed to whisper, her voice a dry rasp. He shook his head slightly, a gesture of dismissal. The identity of the riders was irrelevant. Their intent was all that mattered. "They're circling south," he said. "Might cross the creek bed by morning. Might not." He looked back at her lamp. Best to douse it. He offered the jerky again, a small, insistent push of his hand into the space between them. "Eat. It'll be a long night." She stared at the strip of dried venison. It was a simple, practical offering, the kind one hunter might make to another. An acknowledgement of a shared reality, a shared danger. To refuse it would be an insult. To accept it felt like an act of surrender, a concession of trust she was not prepared to make. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm. She took the jerky, her gaze locked on his face, trying to read the shadows there. His eyes were dark, set deep beneath a heavy brow, and they revealed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had spent too much time looking at distant horizons, a man accustomed to silence and solitude. She retreated a step, back into the relative safety of her cabin. He remained on the stoop, a guardian or a jailer, she couldn't tell which. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his boots and carrying the scent of rain and cold stone. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing everything. "Why help me? Why come here? What do you want?" He shifted his weight, the leather of his gear creaking softly. He looked up at the jagged line of the canyon rim, now a black saw blade against a star-dusted sky. "This is hard country," he said, not to her, but to the darkness itself. No place for folks to be alone. The statement was simple, a stark piece of truth that cut through her fear and loneliness and resonated deep in her bones. It was not an offer of pity. It was a statement of fact from a man who knew the unforgiving nature of this land better than anyone. He understood her solitude in a way the pitying townspeople never could. He lived it. Without another word, he stepped back from the door, melting into the shadows from which he had emerged. For a moment, she thought he was gone. But then she saw him, a darker patch of darkness, settling himself on the ground with his back against the rough-hewn logs of her cabin wall, his rifle laid across his lap. He was not leaving. He was staying, a silent, self-appointed watchman. Alara stood in the doorway, the piece of jerky clutched in her hand, her heart a wild, frantic thing. She was trapped in her own home with a stranger outside, guarding her from other strangers in the dark. The sheer insanity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. She backed away from the door, her movements stiff and automatic, and walked to the table. Her hand shook as she reached for the lamp. She looked at its warm, golden glow, the only comfort she had against the night. Then she thought of his words. Light carries. With a deep, shuddering breath, she turned the small key, and the flames sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into absolute blackness. The liar's wind howled outside, and for the first time, she was not entirely alone with the ghosts it carried. The darkness was a living thing. It pressed in on her, thick and suffocating, erasing the familiar lines of her small world. The cabin, her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its dimensions defined only by the sounds that echoed within it. The frantic beat of her own heart, the whisper of her clothes as she moved, the creak of a floorboard under her tentative weight. She stood by the table for a long time, her eyes straining to find a shape, a sliver of moonlight, anything to anchor herself. But the night was moonless, the sky a blanket of black velvet. Outside, the wind moaned, a mournful, ceaseless sound that scraped at her nerves. And somewhere in that wind, somewhere just beyond the thin log walls, Silas sat. The knowledge was a hard knot in her stomach. She could not see him, could not hear him, but she felt his presence as surely as she felt the cold seeping up from the packed earth floor. Her fear had changed its shape. The immediate, sharp-edged terror of his arrival had dulled into a low, humming dread, a tension that vibrated in the very air. Who was this man? The town's pariah, the wilderness ghost, now her unlikely protector. She crept toward the window, her bare feet silent on the rough sawn planks. She peered through a small gap in the wooden shutters, but there was nothing to see but an impenetrable wall of black. She listened, straining to hear over the wind. Was it the crunch of a boot on gravel? The jingle of a harness? Or just the canyon playing tricks on her, turning the rustle of leaves into the footfalls of approaching men? The three riders, not drovers. The words echoed in her mind. Men with no legitimate business in these remote canyons were men whose business was trouble, robbery, or worse. She thought of the few things of value she owned. Thomas's watch, her mother's silver locket, the small amount of cash hidden in a loose-leafed Bible. It was little enough, but more than enough to be killed for out here. She backed away from the window and felt her way to the hearth. The embers were a faint, pulsing orange, the heart of the dying house. She sank down onto the floor, her back against the cool field stones, and drew her knees to her chest. She should be terrified of the man outside. Every instinct, every warning she had ever received, screamed that letting a strange man, a man with his reputation, this close was a fool's act. Thomas had been a good man, a trusting man, but even he had a cautious streak. Some men, Elara, their loneliness has soured, turned them mean. Was Silas one of those men? Yet his actions contradicted the town's whispers. He had not threatened her. He had warned her. He had given her food. He was sitting outside in the cold, keeping watch. Why? The questions circled endlessly in her mind. Perhaps he saw her as a fellow creature of this wilderness, subject to the same rules of survival. Or perhaps it was something simpler, a flicker of decency in a man the world had discarded. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. Sleep was an impossibility. Her body was rigid with tension, her ears attuned to every nuance of the night. She found herself listening for sounds from him. A cough, a shift in position, anything to remind her that he was real, that this wasn't some fever dream born of grief and fear. But there was nothing. He was as silent as the stones he sat against. That stillness was, in its own way, more unnerving than any sound would have been. It spoke of an immense patience, a discipline that was almost inhuman. It was the stillness of a predator, yes, but also the stillness of a guardian, a mountain watching over its valley. She thought of the jerky she still clutched in her hand, its smoky, salty scent filling her senses. Slowly, she raised it to her lips and took a small bite. It was tough, chewy, and deeply savory, the taste of the wild of survival. As she chewed, a strange sense of calm, fragile as a cobweb, began to settle over her. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was a shared vulnerability. They were two solitary beings, huddled together in a vast and dangerous darkness, bound by a common threat. Sometime deep in the night, the wind died down. The sudden silence was more alarming than the noise had been. Now, every tiny sound was magnified. The scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the drip of condensation from the eaves, and then another sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the clink of a horseshoe on rock. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled back to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her eye to the crack, her world reduced to a narrow, vertical slice of the night. For a long time, there was nothing. Had she imagined it? Then she saw them. Movement. 3 indistinct shapes on horseback, moving slowly along the creek bed at the bottom of the canyon floor. They were just silhouettes, wraiths against the slightly less black expanse of the landscape. They did not have a lantern. They were moving in the dark, confident and quiet. Not drovers. Silas had been right. Her blood ran cold. They were real. The threat was real. She watched, mesmerized by terror, as they passed the turnoff to her homestead and continued down the canyon. They hadn't seen her. The doused lamp, the suffocating darkness, it had worked. They had passed her by. She sagged against the wall, weak with relief. Her legs trembled so violently she had to slide down to the floor. She sat there in the dark, breathing in ragged gasps. The immediate danger passed, but its phantom presence still chilling her to the bone. She thought of Silas sitting outside. He must have seen them too. He had known. He had anticipated their path, their timing. This was his world. He read its signs and portents like a scholar reads a book written in tracks and wind and the behavior of animals. A book she was completely illiterate in. The cabin no longer felt like a cage, but a refuge. A refuge he had secured. She stayed by the window, watching the spot where the riders had disappeared, until the first hint of dawn began to dilute the darkness, turning the black to a deep, bruised gray. The night was over. They had survived it. And as the fragile light of a new day began to seep into her home, Elara knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that nothing would ever be the same again. The dawn arrived not with a triumphant burst of color, but as a slow, tired dilution of the night. A pale, watery gray seeped over the canyon rim, revealing the familiar shapes of the rocks and trees, their edges softened by mist. The world outside her window looked weary, washed out, as if it too had held its breath all night. Alara felt a bone-deep exhaustion, a hollowness behind her eyes from lack of sleep and sustained fear. Yet beneath the fatigue, there was a new sensation, the simple, profound relief of survival. She had faced the night and the fear it held, and she was still here. The cabin was still standing. The world was still turning. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints stiff and protesting. The first thing she did was look for him. She moved to the door, her hand hesitating on the latch before she slowly, quietly, lifted it and pulled the door inward just an inch. She peered through the crack. He was gone. The spot where he had sat against the wall was empty. For a disorienting moment, she wondered if she had dreamed him, if the entire night had been a hallucination born of loneliness. But then she saw the proof of his presence. 2 faint impressions in the dirt where his boots had rested, and a single, spent rifle cartridge gleaming like a copper bead in the soft morning light. He had been here. He had been real. A wave of something akin to disappointment washed over her, so unexpected it startled her. She had expected him to be there, a stoic fixture in the morning light. His silent departure left a void. She opened the door wider and stepped out onto the stoop. The air was cold and clean, smelling of damp earth and pine. She scanned the clearing, the tree line, the path leading up the canyon. There was no sign of him. He had vanished as silently as he had arrived. It was then that she saw them. The tracks. 3 sets of shod hoof prints in the damp soil near the creek bed, just as he'd said. They were clear and deep, telling a silent story of the night's passage. Seeing them, concrete and undeniable, sent a fresh shiver of fear through her. The danger had not been a product of her imagination. It had passed within a stone's throw of her door. He had saved her, whether by design or by simple, pragmatic caution. His warning and his presence had shielded her. She turned back into the cabin, her mind reeling. The encounter had rearranged the very furniture of her world. The clear lines between safety and danger, friend and foe, had been blurred. The man the world called savage had acted with a quiet, profound civility, while the civilized men of Providence offered only veiled threats and predatory pity. She moved to the hearth and began to build a fire, her hands working automatically. She needed the warmth, the light, the simple, domestic ritual of it to chase away the lingering chill of the night. As the kindling caught and flames began to lick at the larger logs, she filled the coffee pot with water and grounds, her hands moving with a new purpose. As she worked, a resolve began to form within her. She could not let his gesture pass unacknowledged. It was a debt that needed to be honored, however small the repayment. Just as the water began to boil, a shadow once again fell across the doorway. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, a cry catching in her chest. It was him. He stood in the same spot as the night before, his rifle held loosely in one hand. In the clear light of morning, she could see him properly for the first time. He was older than she had thought, perhaps 40. His face was weathered, browned by sun and wind, and etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. A dark, untrimmed beard covered his jaw, but it could not soften the harsh set of his mouth. His eyes, though, were the most arresting feature. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. They swept over her, the newly lit fire, the coffee pot, before settling on her face. There was no warmth in them, but no malice either. Only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. He was about to turn and leave, his purpose, to check on her, she now realized, apparently fulfilled. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. He paused, his body angled away, but his head turned back toward her. The silence stretched. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. "The riders," she began, "they passed by. I saw them." He gave a single, curt nod. He already knew. Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and insufficient. He did not acknowledge her thanks. His gaze flickered to the rifle above the mantelpiece. "You know how to use that?" he asked, his voice the same low rumble as before. The question was not an accusation, but a simple, practical inquiry. Shame washed over her. Thomas tried to teach me, she admitted quietly. I'm not very good. He looked from the rifle back to her, his expression unreadable. Good enough is all that matters, he said. It was the most he had said at one time. An impulse, bold and sudden, seized her. Would you take a cup of coffee? The offer hung in the air, a fragile bridge across the chasm of silence and suspicion that separated them. She expected him to refuse, to grunt and disappear back into the wilderness that had formed him. He stood motionless for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on her. She could see the conflict in him, the ingrained habit of solitude warring with some other, unidentifiable impulse. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, he stepped inside. He did not come far, stopping just inside the door as if ready to bolt at any moment. He leaned his rifle against the wall, an act of trust so profound it made her breath catch. He moved with a quiet economy, a lack of wasted motion that she was beginning to recognize as his signature. She turned quickly to the hearth, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the steaming black coffee into 2 tin cups. She handed one to him, their fingers brushing again. This time, she did not pull away. He took the cup, his large, rough hands cradling it as if for warmth. He did not drink immediately, but stood there, watching the steam curl into the cool morning air. The shared silence was different now. It was not the tense, fearful silence of the night, but something else. A quiet space where 2 solitary people could simply exist without the need for words or pretense. He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes closing for a brief second. When he opened them, his gaze fell on a dark, damp patch on the ceiling in the corner of the cabin. Roof's leaking, he stated, another simple fact. Then his eyes moved to the small, pathetic stack of firewood she had managed to chop. Wood piles low for winter, he saw everything. He saw all her failings, all her vulnerabilities laid bare. But in his voice, she heard not judgment but observation, a diagnosis of problems that needed solving. He finished his coffee in 2 more long swallows, then placed the empty cup on the edge of her table. "Ma'am," he said, the single word serving as both farewell and acknowledgement. He picked up his rifle, and with a final, lingering look that she could not decipher, he was gone, disappearing back into the canyon as if he were just another one of its secrets. Alara stood alone in her cabin, the scent of his wood smoke and the wildness still lingering in the air, a tin cup warm in her hands. In the days that followed, a strange and silent rhythm established itself. Alara did not see Silas, but she felt his influence, a ghostly presence shaping the edges of her life. 2 days after their shared coffee, she was startled from her mending by a sound on the roof. Her first instinct was terror, a jolt that sent the needle pricking into her finger. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and crept to the door, her heart pounding. Peering out, she saw nothing, but the scraping sound continued above her. Stealing her nerves, she went outside and looked up. It was him. He was on her roof, moving with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, a small bundle of fresh-cut shingles beside him. He did not look down at her or acknowledge her presence in any way. He simply worked, his hammer falling in a steady, rhythmic beat as he methodically replaced the rotting wood that had caused the leak. She stood there for a long time, watching him, a maelstrom of conflicting emotions swirling inside her. She felt a profound sense of trespass, of invasion. This was her home, Thomas's home, and he was on it, changing it, without her permission. But that feeling was quickly overwhelmed by a powerful wave of gratitude, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. The leak had been a constant source of worry, a symbol of the slow decay she felt powerless to stop. And here he was, simply fixing it. He expected nothing. He asked for nothing. He just did what needed to be done. She retreated back inside, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and relief, and spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated awareness, listening to the sounds of his labor above her. By late afternoon, the hammering stopped. When she dared to look outside again, he was gone. But on her stoop, laid neatly on a bed of ferns, were 2 plump rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot. This became their language, a silent barter of necessity and skill. He would appear, fix a sagging fence post, clear a fallen tree from the path to the creek, or reinforce the door on her dilapidated root cellar. And always he would leave a contribution from his hunt: a brace of quail, a string of fish, once a small haunch of venison. In return, Ilara began to leave things for him. She would bake an extra loaf of bread, the scent of it filling the small cabin with a warmth that felt like defiance against her grief. She would set it on a large, flat stone near the edge of her clearing, a landmark on the trail that led up to his remote shack. Sometimes she would leave a jar of the wild berry preserve she'd put up with Thomas the summer before, or a few potatoes from her dwindling supply. The offerings were always gone by the next morning. They never spoke of it. They never needed to. It was an arrangement born of the canyon itself, governed by its harsh, unspoken laws of interdependence and survival. With the immediate threats of starvation and exposure held at bay by this strange, silent partnership, Ilara found a small space to breathe, to think. The crushing weight of her grief was still there, a constant ache in her chest, but it was no longer all-consuming. A new feeling was taking root alongside it: determination. She looked at Thomas's rifle, not with fear, but with a dawning sense of responsibility. Good enough is all that matters. Silas's words had stuck with her. She began to take the rifle down from its brackets each afternoon. At first, her hands trembled just holding it. The weight of it was immense, a solid, unforgiving reality. She practiced the motions Thomas had taught her, working the lever action, feeling the satisfyingly solid clack of the mechanism. She learned to lift it to her shoulder, to nestle the cold, hard curve of the stock into the soft hollow there, until it started to feel less like a foreign object and more like an extension of her own will. One day, she took one of the precious cartridges from the box in Thomas's trunk and loaded the rifle. She carried it out to the clearing, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. The world seemed to go silent as she raised the rifle, the front sight wavering, dancing around the small target. She remembered Thomas's voice, a calm presence in her memory. "Breathe out, Ilara." Squeeze. She took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The kick was a brutal shove against her shoulder, jarring her teeth. The tin can remained untouched. Smoke curled from the barrel, acrid and sharp. Failure. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. It was useless. She was useless. But as she stood there, the smell of gunpowder in her nostrils, another feeling rose up, pushing back the despair. A flicker of power. She had fired the gun. She had not shied away from its violence. She had stood her ground. She worked the lever, ejecting the spent casing, the scent of hot metal sharp and clean. She loaded another round. She would not be good enough overnight, but she would practice. She would keep practicing until good enough was all that mattered. The dwindling sacks of flour and salt were a constant, nagging reminder of the world beyond the canyon. Her solitude, once a protective shell, was becoming a prison of scarcity. The trip to Providence was a necessity she could no longer postpone. The thought of it filled her with a cold dread. The journey itself was arduous, a full day's ride on her old, steady mare, Buttercup. But it was the destination, not the journey, that she feared. The town, with its gossiping tongues and judgmental eyes, felt more hostile than the wilderness. She packed a small satchel with the few pelts Silas had left for her, beaver and fox, perfectly tanned and soft as velvet, and the last of her egg money. It wasn't much, but she prayed it would be enough. Before she left, she placed a fresh loaf of bread and a small wheel of goat cheese she'd made on the stone at the edge of the clearing. It felt like a prayer, or a ward against the incivility she knew she was about to face. The ride was long and silent, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of Buttercup's hooves and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Ilara felt exposed, vulnerable, out from under the protective watch of the canyon walls. The sky seemed too big, the plains too open. As she neared Providence, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The town appeared as a smudge of brown and gray on the horizon, slowly resolving into a collection of tired-looking clapboard buildings huddled along a single, dusty main street. As she rode in, heads turned. Conversations paused. She felt the weight of their stares, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and suspicion. She was the widow from Twilight Canyon, a story, a piece of local tragedy. She tied Buttercup to the hitching post in front of Henderson's mercantile, her movements stiff and self-conscious. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful, jarring jingle. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, a portly man with a damp smile and eyes that were too small and too close together. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice oozing a false sympathy that made her skin crawl. "A sad sight to see you alone. How are you managing way out there?" "I am managing, thank you," she said, her voice cool and clipped. She placed the pelts on the counter. "I'd like to trade these." Henderson picked up a pelt, his thick fingers stroking the fur with an appraiser's touch. But his eyes were on her. "Fine quality," he murmured. "Very fine. That wild man up the canyon, I suppose?" "Silas." He said the name as if it were a curse. "He does good work, I'll grant him that. A pity he's not fit for civilized company." Elara said nothing, her jaw tight. "A woman like you," Henderson continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "You shouldn't be dealing with the likes of him. It's not safe. You need proper protection. A helping hand." He let the words hang in the air, his meaning as clear and ugly as the stain of tobacco juice on his shirt. "I need flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges," she said, her voice like ice, refusing to acknowledge his insinuation. His smile tightened. He gave her a poor price for the pelts, just as she'd expected, forcing her to ask for credit for the rest of her supplies. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Of course, my dear," he purred, making a note in his ledger. "Anything for you. We'll work something out." The unspoken terms of his offer were a suffocating presence in the small store. While he was measuring out the flour, two cattlemen came in, their spurs jingling on the floorboards. They stopped talking when they saw her, then leaned against the counter and resumed their conversation in loud whispers, clearly meant for her to hear. "That's her," one said. "The one whose husband bought that worthless patch in Twilight Canyon. Heard she's been getting visits from Silas," the other added with a coarse chuckle. "Maybe she's loaning him more than her rifle. If you take my meaning." Their laughter was a physical blow. Elara stood rigid, her face burning with shame and fury, staring straight ahead at a barrel of pickles, pretending not to hear. Mr. Henderson did nothing to stop them, a small, smug smile playing on his lips. She paid for her things, her hands trembling as she gathered the sacks. She could feel every eye in the store on her back as she walked out. The humiliation was a bitter taste in her mouth. This was civilization. This was the society Silas had turned his back on. And in that moment, she understood why. Outside, the sun was blinding. She loaded her supplies on a Buttercup, her movements hurried, desperate to escape. As she was about to mount, she heard another piece of conversation drift from the saloon across the street. "Found what was left of Jedediah's pack mule up near the north rim," a man was saying. "Torn to shreds. Bandits, for sure. Getting bolder. Desperate after the hard winter." The words sent a chill down her spine, a stark reminder that the danger was not just in the past. It was a living, breathing thing, still hunting in the canyons. The memory of the silent riders in the night, of Silas's grim warning, flooded back. She swung herself into the saddle and urged Buttercup into a trot, leaving the whispers and the leering eyes of Providence behind. She was riding back to her solitude, back to the silent man and the clean, honest danger of the wilderness. For the first time, it felt like she was riding home. The journey back to the canyon was a race against the setting sun. Elara pushed Buttercup harder than she normally would, a frantic urgency coiled in her gut. The whispers of the town followed her, clinging like burrs, but they were slowly being replaced by a more immediate and primal fear. Bandits getting bolder. The words were a drumbeat in her mind. She scanned the horizon constantly, her gaze sweeping across the vast, empty plains, seeing threats in every shadow, every dust devil. The rifle, newly purchased cartridges heavy in her saddlebag, felt like a pathetic defense against such a reputation. She was one woman, clumsy and inexperienced, against desperate men. When the familiar, jagged silhouette of the canyon rim finally rose up to meet her, she felt not dread, but a profound sense of relief. It was a fortress, her fortress. As she rode into the familiar clearing, a strange quiet greeted her. The bread and cheese she had left on the stone were gone. A faint curl of smoke rose from her own chimney. For a heart-stopping second, she thought the bandits had found her, that they were inside, waiting. She slid from the saddle, her hand instinctively going to the rifle she'd insisted on keeping close. She crept toward the cabin, her body screaming with tension. But the smoke smelled of pine, and through the window, she could see that the fire in the hearth was banked low and steady, just as it should be. She pushed the door open. The cabin was empty, but it was not as she had left it. A fire burned low, casting a gentle warmth. Her meager woodpile inside the door had been replenished, stacked high with freshly split, dry logs that reached halfway to the ceiling. Silas. He must have seen her smoke was gone and come to check, tending her fire like a promise. The quiet, profound gesture of care, coming so soon after the ugliness of the town, was overwhelming. She leaned against the doorframe, the strength going out of her legs, and wept. They were not tears of grief or fear, but of a desperate, wrenching gratitude. The next day, the sky turned the color of lead, and a bitter wind began to howl down the canyon, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. The storm arrived with a terrifying ferocity, a blizzard that descended like a white curtain, erasing the world. Within hours, the landscape was buried, the trees groaning under the weight of the snow, the canyon walls invisible behind the swirling vortex of white. Alara was trapped. The cabin, once a refuge, began to feel like a ship adrift in a vast, white sea. The wind shrieked and battered the walls, finding every crack and creaking timber. A fine dusting of snow blew in under the door, and the cold was a physical entity, a predator seeking to leech the life from her. She fed the fire constantly, the beautiful stack of wood Silas had left her dwindling at an alarming rate. For 2 days, she did not step outside. The world was nothing but the howling wind and the swirling snow seen through her small window. On the 3rd day, the wind lessened, but the snow continued to fall, thick and silent, piling up in enormous drifts against the cabin. Her woodpile was almost gone. The cold was winning. The warmth from the fire barely reached the corners of the room. A deep, primal fear, the fear of freezing to death alone, began to take hold. She huddled by the hearth, wrapped in every blanket she owned, feeding the last few logs into the flames one by one, trying to stretch out her remaining time. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket. This was how it would end. Not with a bang, but with the slow, inexorable creep of the cold. She was down to the last log. It was a small one, and it would not last long. She stared at it, her mind numb. She thought of Thomas, and for the first time, she felt an urge to join him, to simply let go and let the cold take her. The fire was sputtering, the flames shrinking to blue flickers dancing on the embers. The cabin grew noticeably colder. This was it. She closed her eyes. Then, a loud thud against the door made her gasp. It was followed by a scraping, groaning sound. Someone was outside, trying to get through the massive drift that had buried her entrance. Panic seized her. The bandits? Had they found her, even in this? The scraping grew more frantic, and then with a great heave, the door burst inward, bringing with it a cascade of snow and a blast of frigid air. A figure stood there, a behemoth caked in ice and snow, almost unrecognizable. For a moment, she didn't know who it was. Then he pushed the fur-lined hood back from his face. Silas. His beard and eyebrows were white with frost, his face raw and red from the wind, but his gray eyes were clear and fiercely alive. He was dragging something behind him, a massive pine log, bigger than any she could have hoped to move on her own, and still dark with the dirt of the forest floor. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His jaw was likely frozen shut. He shoved the log through the doorway with a grunt of effort, its length filling half the small room. Then he followed it in, pushing the door shut against the swirling snow and dropping the heavy bar into place. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, clouds of vapor pluming from his mouth and nostrils. He looked at her, huddled by the dying fire, then at the pathetic embers themselves. Without a word, he went to the hearth. He took out his knife and began expertly shaving dry wood from the heart of the massive log he'd brought. He arranged the shavings on the embers, blowing on them with a steady, patient breath until a small flame flickered to life. He added larger pieces, tending the new fire with a focused intensity, until it was roaring, a blazing inferno that pushed back the killing cold and filled the cabin with a glorious, life-giving heat. Only then did he seem to notice her again. He looked at her, then gestured toward the fire with his head. A clear, simple command: get warm. The immediate danger had passed. He had walked through a blizzard, through a wall of snow, to save her. And as she crept closer to the magnificent fire he had built, she felt the first stirrings of a thaw, not just in her frozen limbs, but in the deepest, most frozen corners of her heart. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them together in the tiny cabin. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the relentless howl of the wind and the white chaos that beat against the windows. Inside, a new world was taking shape, a world that consisted only of the two of them, the roaring fire and the small shared space. The initial awkwardness of his presence, the sheer size of him seeming to shrink the room, slowly dissolved into a comfortable, necessary silence. They moved around each other with a quiet, unconscious grace, a dance of 2 solitary people learning to share territory. He was a creature of profound practicality. He spent hours methodically splitting sections of the great log he had dragged inside, his axe rising and falling with an efficient rhythm that was mesmerizing to watch. He showed her, with gestures and a few clipped words, how to bank the fire at night, covering the coals with ash so a warm heart would remain until morning. It was a simple trick, a piece of wilderness knowledge she had never learned, and it felt like a gift of immense value. In the long hours, they fell into a routine. She would cook, making stews from the rabbits he had brought and the vegetables from her root cellar. He would eat silently, his focus entirely on the food, but she saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the way the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to soften with the warmth of a hot meal. He, in turn, took it upon himself to maintain their fortress. He reinforced the shutter that was rattling in the wind, using a strip of leather from his own pack. He showed her how to read the patterns the frost made on the window pane, explaining how the feather-like crystals meant the deepest cold was yet to come. His voice, when he used it, remained a low rumble, but it lost some of its gravelly disuse. It was the voice of a teacher, a man sharing a knowledge so ingrained it was part of his very being. One evening, as the fire crackled and threw dancing shadows on the walls, he was cleaning his rifle, his large hands moving with an intricate and surprising delicacy. Alara sat mending one of Thomas's old shirts, the familiar act of comfort. The silence was deep but not empty. "You lost someone," she said, the words emerging softly without her conscious thought. It was not a question. It was a statement of recognition. She saw the same hollowed-out space behind his eyes that she saw in her own reflection. He stopped his work, his hand stilling on the oiled rifle barrel. He stared into the fire, his profile a stoic mask of stone in the flickering light. For a long time, she thought he would not answer. "A wife," he said finally, his voice so quiet she barely heard it over the wind. "And a daughter." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The 3 words held a universe of pain, a loss so profound it had clearly driven him into this self-imposed exile, away from a world that could inflict such wounds. "Fever," he added, a single, brutal word of explanation. Alara's needle stopped. Her own throat felt tight. Fever. The same faceless enemy that had stolen Thomas from her. In that moment, the chasm between them, of background, of reputation, of gender, vanished. They were simply two people scarred by the same fire, survivors of the same shipwreck. "My husband," she whispered. "Thomas." 3 months ago. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. And for the first time, his pale gray eyes held not just watchfulness, but a flicker of shared understanding. A deep, sorrowful empathy. He gave a single, slow nod. No words of pity. No empty platitudes. Just a silent acknowledgement of her grief. A grief he knew intimately. The connection that formed between them in that moment was stronger than any bond forged by words. It was a bond of shared hardship, of survival, a recognition that they were both ghosts of a fashion, haunted by the lives they had lost. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, in the warm glow of the fire, the deepest part of the winter had finally broken. The thaw had begun, slow and painful, but undeniable. When the storm finally broke, it was as if the world was born anew. The silence was the first thing she noticed, a profound, ringing stillness that was almost as deafening as the wind had been. Alara opened the door to a landscape of impossible beauty and starkness. The snow was a thick, pristine blanket, sculpted by the wind into fantastical drifts and dunes, sparkling under a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was so cold it burned in her lungs, but it was clean, pure. The world felt scrubbed clean of all its sorrow and fear. Silas stood beside her, his gaze sweeping over the transformed canyon. "Hungry time's comin'," he said, his voice practical, pulling her from her reverie. For man and beast, he was right. The beauty was deceptive. For the predators of the canyon, the four-legged and the two-legged alike, this deep snow mint game was scarce and desperation was high. The bandits would be bolder than ever. They spent the day digging out, a shared, strenuous labor. He showed her how to construct a makeshift snowshoe from bent branches and leather strips. Working together, they cleared a path to the woodpile and the small, half-buried barn where Buttercup had been sheltered. The physical work was grounding, the rhythmic scrape of their shovels a comforting sound in the vast silence. They moved with an easy, unspoken coordination, each anticipating the other's needs. The barriers between them had fallen away, replaced by the simple, solid reality of partnership. But the peace of the post-storm world was fragile, an illusion waiting to be shattered. Late the next afternoon, as the sun began its descent and the snow-covered landscape glowed with pink and gold, the sound came. A dog barking. But it wasn't a dog. It was a sharp, aggressive yapping from the far side of the canyon. Silas froze, his head cocked, listening. "Fox," he said, his voice tight. Spooked by something, he scanned the canyon rim, his eyes narrowed. "Get inside," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bar the door." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Alara's stomach. She rushed inside, her heart pounding. She did as he said, dropping the heavy wooden bar across the door, her hands trembling. She ran to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. Silas had disappeared. Then she saw him, a dark shape moving with fluid speed along the edge of the tree line, his rifle in his hands, using the deep shadows as cover. He was circling, positioning himself. And then she saw what the fox had been screaming about. 3 riders, emerging from a copse of snow-laden pines on the far side of the clearing. The bandits. They were back. They looked different this time. Thinner, harder, their faces chapped and grim. The desperation Silas had spoken of was etched into their posture, in the hungry way their eyes scanned her small homestead. Her cabin, with its plume of smoke signaling warmth and life, was an irresistible target, a beacon of hope for them, a signal of doom for her. The leader, a tall man with a cruel, thin-lipped mouth and a long, greasy coat, nudged his horse forward. The other 2 fanned out, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin, their horses blowing steam in the frigid air. "Hello, the house," the leader called out, his voice carrying with an unnerving confidence in the still air. "We're weary travelers, ma'am. Just looking for a warm fire and a bit of charity." Alara's blood ran cold. It was a lie, thin and transparent. Her mind screamed. She was alone. Silas was out there somewhere, but he was one man against three. She looked at Thomas's rifle, resting on its pegs over the hearth. Good enough is all that matters. Her own voice, a whisper in the silent cabin. A change had happened to her. In the long nights of fear, in the crucible of the storm, something had been forged. The brittle, terrified woman who had flinched from the rifle's kick was gone. In her place was someone else, someone who had survived. She would not cower. She would not wait to be a victim. This was her home. With a steady hand, she reached up and took the rifle from its brackets. The wood was smooth and cool, the weight familiar, comforting. She moved to the window beside the door, her heart hammering not just with fear, but with a cold, clear resolve. She was not a widow cowering in the dark anymore. She was the woman of this house, and she would defend it. The leader of the bandits dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. His smile was a predatory slash in his bearded face. "No need to be shy, ma'am," he called, his voice slick with false reassurance as he took a step toward the door. "We don't mean no harm." The lie was so blatant it was insulting. His eyes roved over the cabin, the barn, calculating, assessing. He was undressing her home with his gaze, imagining its contents his for the taking. Alara watched him through the narrow slit in the shutter, the rifle held tight against her shoulder, the cold metal of the barrel resting on the windowsill. Her breath was a cloud in front of her face in the unheated space by the door. Her fear was a high, thin wire of sound in her ears, but her hands were steady. The hours of practice, the muscle memory she had painstakingly built, now served her. The rifle felt like a part of her. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice ringing out with a clarity and force that surprised even herself. The man stopped, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He glanced at his companions, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He hadn't expected resistance. "Now, little lady," he said, his tone shifting, the pretense of civility dropping away to reveal the hard menace beneath. "There's no need for unpleasantness. You're all alone out here. We just need to warm ourselves, take on some supplies. This is my home," Alara said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "You're not welcome here. Turn around," and right away, the man let out a short, ugly laugh. "I don't think you're in a position to be giving orders." He took another step, then another, his hand moving casually toward the butt of his pistol. "I'm not asking again." In that moment, a flicker of movement from the dense shadows of the pines at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. Silas. He had positioned himself on their flank, a perfect ambush point. His rifle was raised, but he didn't fire. He was waiting. For what? For her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was her fight. He was her support, her backup, but he was letting her make the stand. He was showing her that she could. The leader was now just a few yards from a stoop. One of his companions, a lanky, nervous man, began to sidle his horse toward the barn. They were going to corner her, take everything at once. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. "This is my home." The leader reached the first step of her stoop. His boots scraped on the wood. It was the sound of invasion, of violation. That was the final trespass. Alara did not think. She acted. She centered the rifle's sight not on the man, but on the wooden post of the stoop, a foot to his right. She let out her breath and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was immense, a deafening roar that shattered the canyon silence. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, but she held it firm. Splinters erupted from the post as the bullet slammed into the wood, the impact shockingly violent. The bandit leader yelled in surprise and pain, clutching his face where a piece of flying wood had struck him, and stumbled backward into the snow. The horses shied, rearing in panic. The shot was a signal. From the trees, a second shot cracked, and the lanky man by the barn cried out, clutching his arm as he tumbled from his saddle. Silas. His shot had been precise, disabling, not killing. The third bandit, seeing his leader down and his partner wounded, panicked. He yanked his horse's reins, turning to flee, firing a wild shot from his pistol that went wide, shattering the window of the cabin far from where Alara stood. But before he could escape, Silas was there. He seemed to materialize from the trees, moving with a silent, deadly grace. He did not fire again. He used his rifle as a club, a brutal, efficient swing that knocked the man from his saddle. It was over in seconds. The leader was scrambling to his feet, his face bleeding, his eyes wide with shock and fury. He looked from Alara's window to the formidable figure of Silas advancing on him, and all the fight went out of him. He raised his hands in surrender. The canyon fell silent once more, the only sounds the pained groans of the wounded man and the panicked breathing of the horses. Alara slowly lowered the rifle, her arms trembling with adrenaline. Smoke curled from the barrel, smelling of power and defiance. She had done it. She had not fired in panic or desperation. She had fired with purpose. She had held her ground. She had protected her home. The silence that descended after the brief, brutal confrontation was heavier than any that had come before. It was a silence thick with the smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of fear. Alara watched from the window as Silas disarmed the men with an unhurried, grim efficiency. He tied their hands, his movements practiced and sure. He was wounded. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his deerskin jacket, just below the shoulder. The wild shot from the fleeing bandit hadn't been entirely wide after all. Seeing his injury, a new feeling surged through her, sharp and clear, cutting through the adrenaline and the shock. A fierce, protective urgency. She unbarred the door and stepped out onto the stoop, the rifle still in her hand. The cold air hit her face. The surrendered leader stared at her, his eyes a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He had been defeated not just by the ghost of the canyon, but by the lone, frail woman he had marked as easy prey. She met his gaze without flinching until he looked away. Silas finished securing the men, then retrieved their weapons. He walked over to the man he had shot in the arm and knelt, briefly examining the wound before binding it tightly with a strip of cloth torn from the man's own shirt. It was a gesture of stark, dispassionate mercy. This was not about cruelty for him. It was about neutralizing a threat. He herded the three men together. "Get on your horses," he ordered, his voice flat and cold as ice. "Ride east. Don't stop till you're out of this territory. If I ever see your faces in this canyon again, I will bury you where you stand." There was no doubt in his voice. It was a promise. Scared and bleeding, the men mounted their horses and rode away, not daring to look back. Alara and Silas stood in the snow-filled clearing, watching until they were just small specks in the distance. The threat was gone. He turned to her then, his gray eyes sweeping over her, checking for injury. His gaze lingered on the rifle she still held, then met hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not praise. It was not congratulations. It was something more profound, an acknowledgement, a sign of respect. He had seen her strength, and he was honoring it. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steady. He glanced down at his arm, as if just remembering it. "It's a scratch." It was not a scratch. The snow around his boots was stained with a few bright red drops. "Come inside," she said. It was not a request. It was a quiet command. He hesitated for only a moment before following her into the cabin. The warmth of the fire enveloped them. She pointed to a chair. So for the first time, he did as he was told without question. She put the rifle back in its place above the mantelpiece. It felt different now. It felt like it belonged there. It felt like hers. She fetched the small wooden box where she kept her medical supplies, bandages, a needle, and a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. Her hands were perfectly steady as she helped him out of his heavy jacket and then carefully cut away the blood-soaked sleeve of his shirt. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the flesh of his upper arm. It was deep, but it had passed clean through. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with whiskey, her touch gentle but firm. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, but she saw the tightening of the muscles in his jaw. She stitched the wound closed with neat, small sutures, her mending skills repurposed for a new, more vital task. When she was finished, she bandaged it tightly. Throughout the entire process, he watched her, his expression unreadable, but his stillness was a form of trust she now understood. When she was done, she stood back. "It will heal," she said. He looked down at her handiwork, then back up at her. The space between them was charged with unspoken emotion. The events of the day, of the past months, hung in the air. They were no longer a frightened widow and a mysterious recluse. They were two survivors, partners. "Alara," he said, her name sounding strange and yet perfectly right in his low voice. He had never used it before. She met his gaze, and in the depths of his winter sky eyes, she saw the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. She saw the shared grief, the shared solitude, and something new, something tentative and hopeful beginning to take root. The sun was setting, casting long, blue shadows across the snow and filling the cabin with a soft, golden light. The canyon was quiet. The ghosts were silent. The wind that whispered through the junipers no longer sounded like a liar. It sounded like a promise of a new day, a day to be met not with fear, but with the quiet, resilient strength of two people who had found in the harshest of wildernesses an unlikely home, and in each other an even more unlikely salvation.